The events that happened on January 6th of 2021, a squatter that used a series of lies to incite a violent insurrection against Congress as it was attempting to certify the results of a free and fair presidential election were a very big deal. This includes the failure of security measures on Capitol Hill to protect the building and its occupants from the attack. All of it calls out for a serious response. Precisely what that response should be is a matter for the democratic deliberation and debate informed by input from experts as part of a thorough investigation. But you know what is not a serious response? A proposal basically made last week by the acting chief of the U.S. Capitol Police, Yogananda, I don't even know if I'm saying that name right, Pittman, to install permanent fencing around the Capitol building, along with backup forces that are stationed nearby. But the reaction of lawmakers from both parties, as well as that of Washington, D.C., like the mayor Muriel Bowser, they were quite negative. But basically, the responses were quite negative there. So maybe the core institution of American democracy will end up looking like a remote imperial outpost in need of the permanent physical protection from angry, oppressed citizenry, which is exactly what would happen if the building housing is in the national legislature were permanently ringed by protective fencing with police or soldiers ready to strike insurgents at a moment's notice. Yet the sad fact is that this is exactly the kind of response one might expect from the government of the United States, which has had a record by now of a wild and irrational overreaction to getting caught with its pants down. Kind of an odd way of putting it, but recognizing this unfortunate tendency is the first step toward preventing it from happening again. The trend began with the 9/11 attacks, which traumatized the country and exposing our vulnerability to external enemies with a vividness that left many genuinely shaken. And for much of our history, Americans have felt protected from the worst of the world's problems basically both by the stability of our democracy, of the democratic institutions, and by our physical distance from the powerful rivals abroad. But Al Qaeda's attack showed in spectacular and deadly fashion that stateless opponents on the other side of the planet could hurt, and they hit us badly. The attacks cried out for a decisive response, and the military campaign to break up terrorist training camps in Afghanistan and capture or kill Osama bin Laden was it. Yet, nearly 20 years after American troops first arrived in the country, and close to 10 years after they finally killed bin Laden, we remain there, terrified that if we withdraw, the threat will return to do us harm even further. But then there's also Iraq, the second majority Muslim country that we invaded and occupied in response to the 9/11 attacks. The case for overthrowing the government of Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein was not really based on any evidence of a link between him and the attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, because such a link didn't exist at all on that part. It was based on a strategic calculation, and in a world of recently exposed American vulnerability, we couldn't countenance allowing a sworn enemy of the United States to remain in power, and we needed to demonstrate our toughness. The response to 9/11 was not limited to exertions of military force abroad, but the fact that terrorists were able to hijack multiple airlines with weaponry no more formidable than box cutters they easily smuggled on board, and it led to massive changes in airport security. But now lines at checkpoints were vastly longer and slower, and whole new scanners were developed and deployed at airports around the country to ensure that the events of that September morning would never be repeated ever again. In the most bizarre development of all, the Americans would forevermore be required to remove their footwear while crossing through airport security because a single terrorist 3 months after 9/11 managed to smuggle a defective bomb onto a flight in his shoe. But the point in highlighting these responses to 9/11 is not to mock all or even most of the people who enacted these policies or implemented these changes, but those in positions of responsibility for public safety during and following disastrous events carry a heavy burden that should lead us to judge them with at least a modicum of empathy. But that doesn't mean we should suspend critical scrutiny entirely. But the fact is that from the foreign policy to the full range of airport security implemented by the Transportation Security Administration in the months that led up and following the years of 9/11, not to mention massive new programs of clandestine domestic surveillance, public officials respond to the U.S. failures on that day by embracing an effort above all to appear to be taking the threat of future attack with the utmost seriousness, and appearances were the point. Those in position of public responsibility on 9/11 looked really bad. Nobody saw this hit coming. So in response, they wanted to look tough, serious, decisive. The result was foreign policy of muscle flexing and throwing little countries against the wall to show that we meant business. And the airport safety designed to be a form of security. Okay, yeah, airport safety designed to be a form of security theater. Henceforth, we would be made to stand in the interminable lines and submit to annoying and polite and the pointless rules prior to being allowed to fly, because this would make it look like we were taking the threat of terrorism much more seriously than we were prior to the 9/11 attacks. But when we look like we're being tough, serious, and divisive, and we feel safe, and those in charge of keeping us safe thereby insulate themselves from the criticism that they weren't taking the threat seriously, and before the original bad event took place, just look at how thoroughly we were doing our jobs then. Um, but with memories of the events of January 6th still fresh in our minds, we seem poised to do the same thing again and respond to a traumatic event by making a largely symbolic statement intended to show just how seriously we are, and especially the people who dropped the ball so badly on the day of the melee, and they're taking the threat of a future insurrectionary violence. This would be a terrible But this would be a terrible mistake, basically. Symbols, appearances, and they're undeniably important in politics, but for that very reason, we should be wary of the symbolism of making the U.S. Capitol look like armed encampment protecting itself against a siege by our own citizens. But that would be civically appalling and projecting an image of a country that's embattled and buckling. Its leading institutions needed to protect themselves behind the battlements. But with the threat of political violence rising up just beyond them, it's hard to imagine a symbol that would do more to protect an image or to project an image of Republican decline and tottering on the verge of much darker form of politics. It would also be a massive overreaction to a threat of future violence that should be containable in much less dramatic and invasive ways. Which isn't to say that those ways are easy, but yet there probably needs to be more of a defensive infrastructure that's built on and around Capitol Hill and largely out of sight, and those in charge of it need to do their jobs with much greater vigilance than the U.S. Capitol Police showed on January 6th, but the real essential arduous work must happen elsewhere, and within the Republican Party and within our political culture more broadly, the insurrectionists and those who incited them need to be confronted and decisively defeated politically. If that proves impossible, the country will face a much graver threat than an afternoon of mayhem in the halls of Congress.